Just 1 minute ago the silence shattered. After days of guarded statements and carefully chosen words, Kate's medical team finally confirmed what had been whispered behind closed doors and what William had quietly feared all along. The truth, heavy and irreversible, emerged not with drama, but with devastating clarity. As the world waits for answers, this confirmation marks a turning point. One that changes everything for the family and leaves a nation holding its breath. 1 minute ago. 1 minute ago, the waiting ended, not with urgency, not with raised voices, but with a sentence spoken carefully enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. The room was quiet in the way only private consultation rooms ever are, insulated from the noise of the outside world, sealed off from consequence until the words are finally spoken. The doctors did not rush. They did not soften. They delivered the information exactly as it had been agreed it should be delivered, precisely, responsibly, and without illusion. For Prince William, the moment felt both sudden and inevitable. He had lived inside the waiting for months. The pauses between updates, the careful phrasing that never quite promised reassurance. He had learned to hear what was missing as clearly as what was said. This time nothing was missing. The confirmation was brief. It did not describe a catastrophe. It did not announce a crisis, but it confirmed a reality that could no longer be postponed into uncertainty or quietly reframed as temporary. What had once existed in the margins of possibility had now been given definition. William did not interrupt. He did not ask for clarification. He understood immediately that this was not about something ending. It was about something becoming permanent. Across from him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, absorbed the words with a stillness that only comes after long preparation. She had already endured the private cost of not knowing, the examinations, the recalibration of daily life, the discipline required to appear unchanged while everything beneath the surface adjusted. What changed now was clarity, and clarity carries weight. Outside the room, the palace continued uninterrupted. Staff moved through corridors, unaware that anything had shifted. Schedules held. Messages went unanswered. The machinery of monarchy operated with indifferent precision, untouched by the quiet reckoning taking place behind closed doors. Inside, William felt the recognition settle fully. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing catastrophic had occurred, but nothing would ever return to what it had been before. The doctors finished speaking. There was no closing reassurance, no attempt to soften the implications. They allowed the silence to do its work. When they finally stood to leave, the moment had already passed from uncertainty into consequence. William remained seated for a moment longer. He understood with sudden clarity that the most difficult part was not the confirmation itself. It was what came next. Carrying this knowledge forward into a life that would still be lived in public, still shaped by duty, still expected to look unchanged. The confirmation was complete and the real work had just begun. What the doctors confirmed. The physicians did not speak quickly. They never did in moments like this. They sat across from Prince William and Catherine with the composed stillness of people who understood that language itself could become a form of impact. Each sentence had been considered long before it was spoken. Each pause carried intention. This was not a conversation designed to reassure. It was a conversation designed to define reality with precision. They began by establishing a boundary. What Catherine was facing could no longer be treated as temporary, not an episode to be endured and then left behind. Not a phase that would quietly resolve itself with time and determination. It had crossed a threshold where observation alone was no longer sufficient. It now required active management, deliberate, ongoing, and without assumption. They were careful with the word stability. Stability, they explained, did not mean resolution. It did not mean recovery in the way the word was often understood. It meant that certain parameters could be maintained, but only if others were respected. It meant predictability within limits, not freedom from limitation. It meant that the margin for error had narrowed. They spoke calmly about fatigue, about cumulative strain, about the difference between pushing through discomfort and paying for it later. What had once been framed as resilience, they said gently, now carried risk if misapplied. For Prince William, the distinction landed immediately. This was not a conversation about overcoming something. It was a conversation about living alongside it. The doctor spoke of vigilance not as a temporary phase, but as a permanent feature of daily life. Monitoring would not end after weeks or months. It would become part of the structure, part of planning, part of decision-making that extended far beyond medical settings and into every aspect of routine. They were deliberate in what they did not promise. They did not speak of full restoration. They did not offer timelines that could be cleanly repeated. They did not predict either decline or improvement. They explained instead that progress, if it occurred, would not be linear. That there would be days when Catherine appeared unchanged, energetic, composed, fully present. And there would be days when restraint was required, even if nothing outwardly looked different. They emphasized something that William would return to again and again in the days that followed. Strength could no longer be measured by endurance alone. Ignoring signals would not make them disappear. Misjudging limits would not always result in immediate consequences, but it would always accumulate across the table. Catherine, Princess of Wales, listened with complete attention. This was not unfamiliar territory for her. She had already lived inside many of these realities without the benefit of full definition, the testing, the adjustments, the quiet recalibration of daily life around energy that could no longer be taken for granted. What she wanted now was alignment. When she spoke, her questions reflected that she did not ask how long this would last. She asked how to distinguish determination from depletion, how to pace without retreating, how to remain visible without eroding stability, how to recognize when strength was being preserved and when it was being spent. The doctors responded with the same restraint they had maintained throughout. They explained that the goal was not withdrawal from life or duty but calibration. That visibility could continue but only if it was intentional. That rest was not an indulgence or a concession but a requirement. They spoke carefully about stress not as an abstract concept but as a cumulative force, about how expectation even when welcomed carried weight. About how the body accounted for every demand placed upon it, whether acknowledged or not. They also explained what could not be controlled. There would be unpredictability, good days that arrived without warning, difficult days that could not be anticipated. The task, they said, was not to force consistency, but to protect equilibrium. When the conversation finally slowed, there was no single sentence that marked its end, no dramatic conclusion. The doctors summarized what had been discussed, reiterated their continued involvement, and gathered their notes with professional composure. What remained in the room was not despair. It was clarity. William noticed how different this felt from the months of waiting that had preceded it. Uncertainty had been exhausting in a diffuse way, always present, never defined. This was heavier but more focused. A reality that could now be planned around even if it could not be changed. Catherine acknowledged it with a small nod. Not resignation, not defeat, recognition. Outside the consultation room, the palace continued exactly as it had before. Schedules remained intact. Staff moved through corridors, unaware that a line had just been drawn between before and after. Inside, William understood something with sudden sharpness. The confirmation did not demand retreat. It demanded responsibility. And responsibility, once clearly defined, does not announce itself loudly. It settles quietly and then shapes everything that follows. William's vigil for Prince William. The days following the confirmation unfolded with an unsettling sense of normality. From the outside, nothing appeared altered. Engagements remained on the calendar. Meetings proceeded without delay. His public demeanor held steady, composed, attentive, and deliberate in exactly the way the role required. Those who encountered him noticed no disruption, no visible fracture, no signal that anything had shifted beneath the surface. That constancy was not accidental. It was maintained through effort. Privately, William entered a period he would later come to understand as a vigil, not a vigil of waiting but of watchfulness. He was not anticipating collapse. He was monitoring the balance. Every day became an exercise in calculation. Every decision weighed not only for its immediate necessity, but for the cumulative effect it might carry forward. He noticed everything. He noticed Catherine's energy with an attentiveness that bordered on clinical. The days when she moved with ease, the days when resolve carried her forward, even as restraint might have been wiser. The small pauses she tried to disguise. Moments so subtle that few others would ever register them, but which William now recognized instantly. He did not confront her. He adjusted around her. Schedules were softened without discussion. Space was created quietly, invisibly. He learned to intervene without appearing to do so. Not by saying no, but by shaping circumstances so that no became unnecessary. It was a skill refined over years of public life, now repurposed for something far more intimate. What unsettled him most was not the difficulty of these adjustments, but the realization that vigilance itself had become permanent. At night, when the household finally slept and the day's performances were complete, William allowed his thoughts to travel further than he would permit during daylight hours. He did not dwell on fear. He examined sustainability. How long could this pace be carried forward without cost? Which compromises were harmless, and which would accumulate quietly until they demanded repayment? Where was the line between preservation and denial? These were not questions with immediate answers, but they required consideration all the same. His thoughts turned often to their children, not with alarm but with clarity. Children, he knew, absorbed atmosphere more than explanation. They noticed tone, absence, and shifts in rhythm. William resolved without hesitation that whatever recalibration lay ahead would be absorbed upward by adults, by institutions, by systems designed to bear weight and never pass down to those too young to name it. This resolution was absolute. He also thought about legacy, though not in the abstract sense so often attached to monarchy. He thought about it practically, about what it meant to inherit an institution built on continuity and what it demanded in return. He had always understood that the crown required sacrifice. What he was confronting now was how quietly that sacrifice was expected to be made and how little space there was to acknowledge it. There were moments rare but real, when frustration surfaced, not anger, not despair. Frustration at the absence of certainty, at the impossibility of planning with confidence, at the knowledge that even the most careful preparation could not eliminate unpredictability. These moments never lasted long. William had learned early that frustration served no purpose unless it sharpened judgment. What he did not experience was panic. Panic belonged to moments of chaos, to situations that felt uncontrolled. This was not that. This was defined. Heavy, yes, but bounded. It demanded discipline rather than fear. Still, the vigilance carried a cost. William found himself scanning days rather than inhabiting them. He measured success not by accomplishment but by equilibrium, by whether the day ended without extracting something unseen. He learned to evaluate moments not for how they appeared, but for what they consumed. In quieter moments, he recognized a truth that unsettled him more than any diagnosis ever could. The future he had once assumed no longer existed in its previous form, not erased, rewritten. The certainty of trajectory had given way to something conditional, something that required constant attention. And yet within that recognition there was also resolve. William did not frame this as a loss. He framed it as a responsibility sharpened by clarity, made heavier by love, complicated by duty. He understood now that his role was not to control outcomes. It was to protect the balance between visibility and preservation, between duty and endurance, between strength and restraint. The vigil was not about waiting for deterioration. It was about guarding stability. Each morning he rose with quiet determination. Each evening he assessed what had been spent and what remained. He learned to accept days that felt unchanged without assuming they would always be so. He learned to accept difficult days without treating them as omens. This was endurance of a different kind. Not dramatic, not visible, but constant. And William understood with a steadiness that surprised even him that this vigilance was not temporary. It was the new discipline of love, responsibility, and foresight carried quietly, without announcement, and with no expectation of recognition. The household closes in. The shift inside the household did not arrive with an announcement. It never did. There was no meeting where everything was explained. No formal acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. Instead, awareness spread the way it always did within royal walls, through pattern, through adjustment, through the sudden tightening of routines that had once felt flexible. Senior aides noticed at first, not because anyone told them, but because diaries began to change in subtle ways. Engagements were no longer stacked back-to-back without pause. Travel windows widened. Margins appeared where margins had never been allowed before. What looked on paper like minor logistical refinements carried a deeper implication. Endurance was now being actively protected. No one asked why. In the household, asking unnecessary questions was a skill unlearned long ago. Language shifted next. Internal briefings grew shorter, leaner, stripped of speculation. Phrases that invited interpretation were quietly retired. Words like temporary and return vanished from circulation, replaced by neutral terms that emphasized balance and pacing. There was no panic in this transition, only discipline. The palace was doing what it had done for generations when private gravity threatened public continuity. It closed ranks. Medical considerations were folded seamlessly into planning discussions without ever being named as such. Rest was protected institutionally, not as a kindness but as a requirement. Decisions were framed around sustainability rather than visibility, though the latter was never fully surrendered. What mattered most was consistency. The institution understood something instinctively. Sudden absence invites speculation. Gradual recalibration invites acceptance. The public could be trained gently and over time to expect less density without ever being told why. That training had already begun. For Prince William, this phase required a different kind of leadership. He approved adjustments quietly without commentary. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was allowed to feel reactive. Each change was positioned as intentional, even inevitable. Control was maintained not through rigidity but through coherence. For Catherine, Princess of Wales, involvement remained her choice. She was not sidelined. She was not shielded from decisions that affected her role. If anything, her authority within the household sharpened when she spoke. Her preferences were treated as directives, not suggestions. This was not retreat. It was refinement. Staff learned quickly which engagements mattered most to her, not institutionally but personally. They learned when flexibility was essential and when firmness was protective. The household did not question these distinctions. It adapted to them. There were inevitably moments of unease, not fear, unease. The kind that arises when experienced professionals sense a long-term shift without being given a name for it. Long-serving aides understood that this was not a temporary phase of adjustment. It was structural, and structure once altered rarely returned to its original form. Still, there was no dissent. The monarchy did not operate on consensus. It operated on alignment. Meetings became quieter. Decisions were reached faster. There was less debate, less theatrical deliberation. Everyone understood the objective. Maintain continuity without strain. Preserve dignity without denial. What was striking was what did not happen. There were no leaks, no whispered briefings, no sympathetic narratives floated quietly to test public reaction. The palace held its line with unusual discipline. This was not a story it wanted interpreted prematurely nor sensationalized without context. Silence for now was the most responsible option, and silence when maintained collectively becomes powerful. William sensed the shift even when it was not spoken. He noticed how efficiently things moved, how few explanations were required. The institution was absorbing pressure exactly as it had been designed to do, redistributing weight upward, outward away from the center. That redistribution was deliberate behind closed doors.